I was never close to my grandfather. He was always a distant figure, wrapped in secrets, absent in every sense. When he died, my family felt a strange mix of shock and relief. It was as if something dark that had hovered over all of us was finally released with his passing. Yet even in death, he seemed to exert an oppressive, inescapable presence. I was tasked with going to his apartment, located in an old, decaying building hidden in a forgotten corner of the city. The task seemed simple. Grab a family photo album and a box of documents. But from the moment I entered the neighborhood, a feeling of unease began to creep over me. The building looked frozen in time, as if trapped in an era the world had forgotten. Shattered windows, crumbling plaster on the walls, and dark stains from moisture gave the place an aura of abandonment. I climbed the creaky stairs, feeling the echo of my footsteps reverberate in the emptiness, as if the building were whispering in response. The air was thick and oppressive, laden with the smell of mildew and something else, something I couldn't identify. When I reached the apartment floor, something immediately caught my attention: a sheet of paper taped to the door. The handwriting was hurried, almost illegible, but the message was clear. If the noise doesn't stop, we'll call the police. Noise? That didn't make any sense. My grandfather had been dead for 4 days. My mind tried to rationalize the message. Maybe it referred to some other noise in the building, something I didn't need to worry about. With a slight tremble in my hands, I took the key from my pocket and inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a long, low creak, as if resisting my touch. A cold shiver ran down my spine the moment I crossed the threshold. The air inside the apartment felt heavier, filled with something more than just the smell of mold. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the growing sense that I shouldn't be there. As I opened the door, I was immediately hit by a strong, nauseating smell. It was a mix of mildew and something deeper, more unsettling, like decaying flesh. The apartment was shrouded in an oppressive gloom, with only the faint light from the hallway struggling to penetrate the dark space. I hesitated, feeling like I was trespassing into something that should have been left undisturbed. The first step inside made the floorboards creak loudly, almost as if they were warning me to stay away. The furniture was overturned, papers scattered all over the floor. It looked as though someone had ransacked the place, searching for something, but left the chaos behind. My grandfather, who was always meticulous, would never have let the apartment get to this state. I stood there for a moment, trying to process the scene in front of me. The walls seemed to close in. The air was still, and the darkness felt alive, as if it had its own presence. The light flickered from time to time, and in one of those brief flashes, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A subtle movement, a shadow that seemed to stretch and then vanish. My heart raced, but when I turned my head, there was nothing, just emptiness. Maybe some other relative came here before me, I muttered to myself, though the explanation didn't feel right. The discomfort grew with every step I took. The living room was covered in dust, with an old TV sitting at the center, surrounded by worn-out furniture, scarred by age. The place seemed frozen in time, like a capsule of old, sad memories. There were plates and cups piled on the table, as if my grandfather had simply given up on keeping everything in order. Or as if someone had been here recently. The feeling of being watched intensified with every passing second. Every noise felt amplified in the dense silence of the apartment. The shadows on the walls shifted, moving in sync with the flickering light. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that I was alone, but something deep in my mind told me otherwise. I walked down the hallway leading to the kitchen and the other rooms. The dampness on the walls made it seem as though the place was slowly being consumed by something invisible, something feeding on its own decay. Each step I took strengthened the certainty that something was very wrong in that apartment, something that didn't want to be found. The dining room looked even more deteriorated than the rest of the apartment. The walls were covered in mold, spreading like a disease, reaching every corner. The old wooden table was pushed against the wall, draped in a cloth that had long lost its original color. I rummaged around, trying to stay focused on what I had come for: the family photo album. That's when I saw it. Among the dusty books and scattered papers lay what appeared to be the object I was searching for. a hard-covered album, coated with a thin layer of dust. I picked it up carefully, as if handling something dangerous. I opened the cover. The first pages were filled with ordinary photos, family portraits. There were images of holiday gatherings, birthdays, and everyday events. Photos of my mother, my uncles, and of course my grandfather. At first glance, it seemed like a typical record of a past life. But as I flipped through the pages, the photos began to change. The people in the images looked different. Something was wrong with their eyes. The sparkle was gone, replaced by a hollow expression, as if they were there, but not really there. The once cheerful pictures started to take on a darker, more disturbing tone. My heart sank as I turned a page and was met with something that made me recoil. The photos were of dead people. Their bodies lay still, eyes wide open, lifeless. In some of the pictures, shadowy figures stood around them, enveloped in a darkness that seemed to swallow everything around them. They were surrounded by candles and strange symbols drawn on the floor around the bodies. My stomach churned. I closed the album abruptly, feeling my hands tremble. What did my grandfather have to do with this? What were these photos? I tried to push the growing horror away, but the feeling that something deeply wrong was unfolding was impossible to ignore. Then the lights began to flicker again, this time more intensely. A distant sound echoed through the apartment. It sounded like something knocking, coming from somewhere within the walls. A chill ran down my spine as I turned to look down the hallway. The darkness had grown thicker. The hallway, once dimly lit, now looked like a pit of shadows, as though the light was being drained away, sucked into something I couldn't see. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the fear pulsing in my chest. Then the sound came again. Footsteps, muffled but clearly coming from inside the apartment. I knew I was alone, but at the same time, I knew I wasn't. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the dark hallway. Each flicker of the light seemed to push the shadow closer, as if it were playing tricks on my perception. The darkness at the end of the corridor was impenetrable, but something within it seemed to move, to writhe. There was a presence there. I could feel it. Something or someone was watching me from the shadows, lurking, waiting. My breathing became erratic. Each breath was harder to take, as if the air itself was becoming too thick, too heavy for my lungs to handle. I tried to step back, but my feet seemed glued to the floor, frozen by the fear that had taken over my body. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed again, louder this time. They were slow, dragging, almost hesitant, as if the thing in the hallway was drawing closer, savoring every second of my agony. The rhythmic tapping of something, maybe nails or fingers, began to resonate through the walls, as if someone was deliberately trying to scare me, stretching the moment of terror. I knew I had to get out of there. My body, however, was in complete panic, refusing to obey me. With trembling hands, I rushed to the front door, my only point of escape. When I grabbed the handle, a chill ran down my spine. The door was locked. I was sure I had left it ajar when I came in. I tried forcing the handle again, panic rising. The key. I fumbled for the key in my pocket, but it no longer fit in the lock. For some reason, the key, that had worked perfectly before, now seemed useless. It was as if the door had been swapped entirely. My heart pounded, and cold sweat dripped down my face. I was trapped. With each failed attempt to open the door, the sensation that something was drawing closer intensified. Then, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they came from behind me, from the hallway. A low, dragging sound, as if something was moving slowly toward me. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to give in to panic, and slowly turned around. The shadow was there, no longer at the far end of the corridor, but closer, more distinct. It was tall, slender, and seemed to float slightly, moving along the walls with a strange, unsettling agility. The light flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadow disappeared. But I could still feel its presence, as if it were in every corner at once, watching. Terror took complete hold of me. I was being hunted, trapped in a cruel game where the shadows seemed to have all the advantages. The floor beneath my feet began to creak again, echoing in the empty apartment. The fear pulsed within me, and the only thought that dominated my mind was, I have to get out of here. With the front door locked and the key useless, my mind raced desperately, searching for a way out. The hallway seemed darker with every passing second, and the shadow, it was there, always lurking, always moving at the edges of my vision. My heart pounded so hard I could barely think straight. I had to move away from the entrance. With no other option, I ran towards my grandfather's office. It was the one room I had always avoided whenever I visited him, even as a child. There was always something strange about it, a dense, uncomfortable energy. Now, the door was slightly ajar, as if it was waiting for me, as if it knew I had no other choice. As I pushed the door open, the smell of dampness and dust engulfed me even more strongly. The room was cluttered with old folders stacked high, papers scattered across an aged desk, and shelves crammed with ancient books. But it wasn't the papers or the books that grabbed my attention. The walls. They were covered in strange symbols, drawings, and markings that I couldn't understand. They looked ritualistic, as if the room had been used for something dark, something I wasn't supposed to find. Each symbol seemed to tell a grim story, one I could barely begin to comprehend. My stomach churned just from looking at them. In the center of the desk was a wooden box, intricately carved. The wood was worn from time, but the symbols etched into it were sharp, as if they had been made recently. There was something almost hypnotic about that box, as if it were calling out to me, demanding my attention. I knew I should stay away, but I couldn't. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside were 5 candles. They looked old, with a strange smell, like something that shouldn't be touched anymore. Next to them was a folded piece of yellowed paper. I picked it up cautiously, my hands sweaty and hesitant, and unfolded the paper. What I read made my whole body freeze. The handwriting was uneven, but legible enough. The candles are used to mediate contact with spirits. My heart raced. This wasn't what I expected. The candles weren't just part of some old ritual. They were a way to deal with whatever was haunting me. The spirit, the shadow, it all started to make a twisted kind of sense. I was trapped in a macabre game, but maybe the candles could be my salvation. Maybe lighting them was the only way to escape. But there was a problem. I didn't have any matches. The need to act quickly was overwhelming, but the panic made it hard to think. I swallowed hard, and with growing dread in my hands, crept through the apartment. The darkness felt denser now, as if it wrapped around me with every step I took. I headed to the kitchen, trying not to glance at the corners where the shadow might be lurking. With a hesitant touch, I tried flipping the light switch. Nothing happened. The lights refused to work, and the silence in the apartment became deafening. Sweat dripped down my face as I desperately searched for a solution. Finally, my fingers brushed against something useful, a flashlight. The light it cast was weak, flickering occasionally, but it was enough to illuminate the path ahead of me. I continued searching. Every move I made seemed amplified, as if the entire building was listening. After what felt like an eternity, I found a small box of matches in the back of a drawer. That's when I heard a noise, a low sound coming from the direction of the kitchen door. It was slow, heavy breathing, as if something was waiting on the other side. Fear shot through my body, and instinctively I pointed the flashlight at the door. The light flickered and failed, and for a brief second I caught a glimpse of a shadow. Terror overwhelmed me. Trembling with fear, I managed to strike a match, the small flame flickering before me. I turned my head in every direction, trying to see something. But there was nothing there. Wasting no time, I pulled one of the candles from my pocket and held the match to the wick. The flame spread across the candle, casting a faint light, but it was enough for me to place the candle on the kitchen counter. The shadow seemed to retreat, or at least vanish when I did this. A sense of relief, though temporary, washed over me. With the other candles in hand, I took a deep breath. Somehow, I knew these candles would weaken the shadow. It was clear that this was my only way out. Now I had to keep going. With the candles in my hands and my heart racing, every step I took seemed to echo through the darkness of the apartment. The kitchen, where I had left the first lit candle, was behind me, but the oppressive presence of that thing, the shadow, still hung in the air, as if it were watching me, waiting for my next move. My hands were sweaty, making it difficult to hold the candles and the matches. I made my way to the storage room, a cramped, damp space barely big enough to fit into. My thoughts were spinning in a loop of terror and survival. I placed the second candle on the cold floor, and with a trembling match, I lit the wick. As soon as the flame flared, I heard a pained sound. It was a deep groan, as if the building itself was reacting to the light. The floor beneath my feet trembled slightly. My breathing was ragged. The shadow hadn't appeared yet, but I knew it was there, lurking in the corners, watching in some way. Something told me the candles were working, that they were weakening it, but that brought no peace, only a desperate urge to finish this as quickly as possible. I rushed into the living room, where the dimness had become almost solid, as if the air was made of darkness itself. I felt the floor vibrate softly, as if something was moving beneath my feet. I placed the third candle on the coffee table, and with shaky hands, lit it. The flame flickered for a moment before stabilizing, and then came the sound. This time, it was closer. Footsteps, heavy and slow. It was as if something or someone was walking directly toward me, coming from some corner of the room. The shadow was approaching. I could feel the pressure in the air, a presence that couldn't be ignored. My mind screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The sofa creaked as if pushed by invisible hands. The sound startled me, and the TV made a loud pop, breaking the oppressive silence. The shadow was here, closer than ever, and the apartment seemed to react to its presence as if it were part of the very building. With my heart pounding, I ran to the bedroom. The space seemed to close in around me, the walls feeling narrower with each passing second. The sensation of being watched was so intense it was almost unbearable. I placed the candle on the dresser, and with trembling hands lit the wick. As soon as the flame began to glow, I heard the sound of something crawling. It was faint, but unmistakable. The shadow moved quickly at the edges of my vision. I didn't want to look, but I knew it was there. The darkness seemed to fold in on itself, creating shapes and movements where there should have been none. I could feel its presence too close, suffocating. The last room was the office. I ran there, my mind teetering between panic and the hope that this would all end soon. The walls trembled lightly, and the sense that the shadow was everywhere in the apartment pushed me to the edge of collapse. With even shakier hands, I lit the last candle on the desk, next to the wooden box. The sound that followed was deafening. A deep, agonizing scream seemed to emanate from the very walls. The entire building shook, and the floor beneath my feet felt like it was about to collapse. The shadow, now more visible, moved with frightening speed, as if in a frenzy. It seemed weaker, its form less defined, as if the candles were indeed draining its strength. Everything was in chaos. Loud noises came from every direction. Shadows danced around me, and the feeling that I was moments away from being captured consumed me. But deep down, something told me that the end was near. That somehow I was closer to escaping than ever before. I ran to the front door. I grabbed the key with trembling hands and inserted it into the lock. To my surprise, the key finally turned. The sound of the lock clicking was almost like music to my ears. I opened the door with a long, ominous creak, and without looking back, I ran out. My life depended on it, and I knew it. I rushed down the stairs of the building as if fleeing from a living nightmare. My feet pounded against the steps, the sound echoing through the empty hallways, multiplying, as if each step was being followed closely by that presence. The shadow, I knew it was still there, watching me, perhaps lurking in the darkest corners. But something inside me told me it was weakened, that the candles had somehow broken its hold over the apartment. The fresh night air was a relief, but my mind was still gripped by fear. My breath came in ragged bursts, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I was safe, or so I wanted to believe. I looked back at the building. Its dark, dirty windows resembled empty eyes staring back at me, a silent reminder that something terrible still resided within. The decayed facade in the moonlight looked even more sinister than it had during the day. The chill of the night did nothing to ease the constant shiver running down my spine. Even from a distance, I still felt the shadow's presence following me. Somehow I knew this wasn't over. Although I had escaped, something or someone was still watching me. The presence of that shadow seemed to have followed me, even though its form remained trapped in that apartment. I wanted to believe that the candles had weakened the spirit, that the ritual had worked, but doubt lingered. It was as if the weight of everything I had seen and felt was now attached to me, like an invisible shadow that never fully went away. That night, I went home without looking back. All I wanted was to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. But even so, the feeling of being followed, of being watched by something beyond comprehension, never completely left me. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal routine, pushing away the memory of what had happened. No one would believe me if I told them. Who would believe that a shadow, an invisible presence, had hunted me in an abandoned apartment? That a ritual with candles was the only thing that allowed me to escape? It was better to bury it all deep in my mind. But at night, when the lights went out and the silence of my own home took over, I knew I wasn't alone. I felt a presence. Something watched me from the shadows of my own bedroom. No matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling. The shadow, it was still there, lurking, waiting. I escaped that apartment that night, but somehow the shadow seems to have followed me.